What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel's Snap. With the release of Stick, the Captain Carter combo deck got a boost that it seems is going to put it in a space at the very top of the metagame. This is a deck that I already thought was one of the 3 or so best decks, and Stick is a card that works so incredibly well with the game plan it's already trying to accomplish. Now, there is a Silver Surfer in this deck, but don't be fooled. It's very likely that that card will end up being Cosmo or Luke Cage, depending on what you're trying to tech against long term. Right now, what this deck is trying to do is make a very large brood, and there are a bunch of paths to make that happen. Whether that be playing Maverick, activating Maverick on a stick, and then prodigying the Maverick with that stick and Maverick buff on it, or playing a Captain Carter in the second spot in a lane, playing a Maverick behind the Captain Carter in the third spot, and prodigying the Captain Carter in the fourth spot. Really, there are many paths to get to something ridiculous. Mother Askani is, of course, a card that is able to create this stuff almost on her own. And Hope Summers is giving you additional ways to get extra energy, which is really important, not just so you can play 2 3s on turn 5, but so you can play a 4 and a 3 on turn 6. This is particularly relevant a lot of the time because sometimes your turn 6 will be something like activate a Maverick stick brood, and that's a very powerful thing to do. Largely, this is a deck that is built on acquiring some sort of outsized point output, and it is constructed very specifically to deliver that to you in the most efficient way possible. Storm, Horseman of Famine is right now a very core card for this deck, but after the release of Jeff next week, things might be a little more up for debate as to what direction this deck is trying to go. Functionally, though, the role in this metagame that this deck is taking is largely one that is equivalent to, in my opinion, Star-Lord Master of the Sun. It is just so much bigger when it works than anything else, and it is very vulnerable to people actually stopping it from happening. But it's quite difficult to make it not happen. You can do it, but you have to actually have a bunch of specific cards to make that happen. And to me, this is the pole that the metagame is rotating around. In a world where, let's imagine, the Earth is flat, this is the center of the Earth. It is the thing that everything flows outward from. And that is a big deal. This deck sets the tone for the entire metagame. Incredible amounts of points, incredibly difficult to play. The honest analogy for what this deck is in a historical context is Move Bounce back when Human Torch cost 1. And much like Move Bounce, it demands some historically odd decisions from decks that are trying to beat it. I just did a video on this list as well, and really, it is a V-hand list, but functionally, what this deck is actually trying to do is be a deck that has a combination of cards that for sure beats the previous 12 cards. And that combination of cards is Invisible Woman, Shadow King, and Grandmaster, because every bit of power above, let's say, moderate double digits in that previous deck is going to be Shadow Kingable. But the question becomes, how do you actually make that happen? And in a sort of further note, are we going to be able to make that happen if they swap out the card Silver Surfer for the card Cosmo, which I think is a very interesting dynamic to keep an eye on going forward. But for right now, that swap hasn't been made. In fact, what you're seeing a lot of is people swapping out Surfer for Luke Cage. So as long as we're taking advantage of the fact that the 2 most common cards in that 12th spot in the Captain Carter deck are currently Luke Cage and Silver Surfer, or Luke Cage, Silver Surfer, and something that does points and doesn't interact with us, then we're gonna be able to get them out of the game by doing this. In fact, even forcing them to play Cosmo is at least a little bit of a victory for us because, you know, we're gonna be doing this in 2 lanes and they have to actually take turns off to put that Cosmo on the board. It's not to say that they still won't win, but it's actually a pretty big hit to their ability to do their combo, which is pretty on rails when they're actually doing it. Like, you really want to be doing some specific stuff when you're playing the Surfer deck that is like, turn 3, play Storm, turn 4, Captain Carter in the Storm lane, maybe you Agony it, turn 5, play a Maverick behind that, turn 6, you Prodigy the Captain Carter and activate the Maverick on a Brood. They don't have time to play the Storm a lot of the time, or to play the Cosmo a lot of the time. So we got that advantage going for us as well. Now, I know you're like, Cam, why are you talking about the Surfer deck? Why are you talking about the Captain Carter deck? And we're supposed to be talking about the V-Hand deck. This deck is only existing in this form because it has a functional matchup into that deck. That is the only reason I'm playing it. What decks can I reasonably get Invisible Woman, Shadow King, and Grandmaster into? That's a big part of what I'm trying to do in Marvel Snap right now, and still also have an actual functional game plan against the rest of the metagame. That's the biggest question. How do I find a deck that doesn't instantly lose to the point output from the Captain Carter deck, but is still actually playing a reasonable game plan of Marvel Snap that can still compete with people doing like Techno-Organic Virus or playing just points on the board in certain ways? And that's sort of how I arrive at V-Hand. This was the list that I got from Sizer, and I think it's a very solid direction to go. But much like V-Hand is typically going to do in metagames like this, I think it might be one of those cases where we find a better shell in which to do this tech stuff maybe a bit later. Definitely something to keep an eye on. Probably the most common version of Techno-Organic I see is a tie between this one and the big boy one, so we're going to take a look at both. The Techno-Organic Virus spectrum is quite vast. You have a lot of freedom in choosing how to build your deck. This is the one that won my KMBest Block Party tournament in the hands of Andre Var. It is a fully teched out version of the archetype that is just going to say, I have a tech card for whatever matchup I run into, and if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work, but I am at least coming in here prepared. In other words, this is a list that's using Techno-Organic Virus to supplement its power so it can afford to play tech cards. This works pretty well when a lot of those tech cards are not useful in every matchup, and you can just use them as bodies that can catch the virus and just sort of be able to compensate for their otherwise underwhelming stat lines. That's method 1 of building a Techno-Organic Virus deck. Use the power of the virus to compensate for the fact that a lot of your cards don't have incredibly good bodies on rate, and use the fact that the virus just wants bodies to infect to compensate for the fact that at least they have bodies even if they're not going to be good in the specific matchup. The other direction I see Techno-Organic Virus decks going is the exact opposite direction, which is saying, I actually don't care about any of this tech. I am playing Tech Mobius insofar as it is beneficial to my Techno-Organic Virus, and then everything else is just numbers. I'm doing numbers. I'm playing big guys. I'm getting guys on the board that don't die to a Gambit Horseman. I'm getting guys on the board that don't die to a Killmonger necessarily, and I'm just playing a points package that I'm judging to be the most efficient points package in the game, and just going from there. These are the two decks that exist on opposite ends of the spectrum of Techno-Organic Virus decks. At the bottom of the spectrum in terms of point output, we have the tech versions, and at the top of the spectrum in terms of points output, we have these versions which have absolutely no tech in them. I think that Techno-Organic Virus decks are almost certainly the best decks to be playing if you're someone who hasn't hit Infinite yet. These are easy and straightforward and very powerful decks to play that are great choices for the end of the season climb. I talked about the Invisible Woman Grandmaster Shadow King thing a little bit, and I had the idea for a deck that was playing Shadow King Grandmaster in the TOV space, and I tried it and it kind of got nowhere because you need to be able to throw priority, so I just sort of threw it in the trash, gave up on it, and then Invisible Woman showed back up. And suddenly it's like, is it just better to be doing this combination of things as a Techno-Organic Virus deck than it is to be doing this combination of things as a Victoria Hand deck? When I talk about how I'm not sure Victoria Hand is going to be the ultimate final home for that kind of answer, this is the kind of thing that I mean. I haven't had a ton of time to test this, but early returns have been relatively positive, and I've enjoyed what this deck is able to bring to the table in terms of just being a solid proactive deck deck with a specific combination of cards that means it can actually beat the deck that is going to otherwise take it behind the woodshed in the form of the Captain Carter Brood combo deck. I think that's a pretty valuable space to occupy, and it's definitely a shape of deck that I think will likely be successful going forward. Another major beneficiary of the addition of Stick to the game is Zombie Galacti. However, I do think that Zombie Galacti does have a little bit of a hidden cost here, and it is largely that when you're playing against the other deck that got Stick, which is the Captain Carter combo list, you might not actually be able to beat them on points. And I realize that that is mostly indicative of the Captain Carter combo list being largely a pretty ridiculous Marvel Snap deck. And it is a pretty ridiculous Marvel Snap deck, but we live in a world where people can play it, right? And so if you're playing a deck where the premise is, I'm a magic deck, I'm going to have all this time to assemble my combo, I'm going to make a giant stick, and then you run into the deck that is doing that, but maybe a little bit better than you. And that is a very awkward situation. And I do think that it's one of the few decks where typically when you play something like a Magic against one of these turn 6 combo decks, they're not particularly good at using that 7th turn. But the Captain Carter deck is unbelievably good at using that 7th turn. They might be better than you at it, and you're the one who played the Magic. So in as much as this deck definitely got stronger with the addition of Stick, that it is objectively, compared to the previous versions of this deck, a better deck. In context, it might be a little bit worse. And it's not just that matchup, it's also that the things people are doing that are gonna try to beat the additional green power of a Stick Brood deck are also gonna beat your Zombie Galactic deck. And that's a really awkward situation for this deck to exist in. So while it did get better, I think it got a little bit relatively worse. Better in an absolute sense, worse in a contextual one. Cosmo and Juggernaut are particularly powerful cards that do a lot of work in matchups against some of the decks that look to do Captain Carter Stick combo things, because very often they're really only playing one card that has a big bonus in a location, so messing that up is particularly powerful, and Cosmo is powerful for fairly straightforward and obvious reasons. This list comes from Kuhn, who I believe is still top 5 with it. It is a very solid list that has adapted to the higher ceiling by changing Agony out for a symbiote Spider-Man. This gives us more point output so we can actually compete on points, and then we rely on Juggernaut, on Iska, things like that. That kind of thing is typically a powerful way to go about this, and being a deck that has Juggernaut Cosmo built in means that a lot of the stuff that would be typically good against us, that like in the same way as I talked about the dynamic with Zombie Galacti, where this is a deck that is also falling victim to like Shadow King Grandmaster stuff. The fact that you have Cosmo Juggernaut in here means that you get to be one of the safer green power decks right now against people who are doing the kind of things that I'm trying to do here with the Invisible Woman stuff. That's a really big deal, is just being able to be like, I'm naturally good against this. I'm gonna be fine. It's all good. I do not have to worry about it. And then also that stuff is quite good against the Brood combo decks too. And so you end up with a deck that has a very efficient method of creating points that leaves your turn 6 free. And that's really the key here, is that turn 6 in a lot of the other decks is very spoken for, whereas your turn 6 can be all sorts of things. Like if your turn 6 is Juggernaut and a Doctor Strange, pulling a couple of big multiple men, that could be it. It could also be something like a Cosmo and like activating an Aranya onto a Human Torch that you merge with a symbiote Spider-Man. There's a bunch of stuff. It could be a bunch of stuff, right? And so you end up with a bunch of different possible outcomes that make this deck very difficult to play against, and that is ultimately the biggest strength that it has. Phantom X fell off for what was a good reason, but I'm not necessarily sure it's a good reason anymore. And what I mean by that is Phantom X fell off because day 1 of Stick's release was also day 1 of Lady Bullseye's release. So there were a lot of people playing the Carter combo deck with Luke Cage in it. And if they're playing the Carter combo deck with Luke Cage in it, this deck doesn't work. But if people are pressuring them to play things like Cosmo in the deck instead, if people are pressuring them to do that, you as a deck with Marrow and Phantom X can make their whole game plan just not work. Now, granted, you are going to be vulnerable to Luke Cage. There's no real argument about that. But you have so much ability to damage them in the world where they are being forced or even choosing to play something else. I think a lot of people right now are defaulting to a Surfer in that slot. It's good, don't get me wrong, but it's not going to stop this deck from putting you in the ground. And that's what Phantom X does. It's a boring but good tech deck. If anything in this deck is the Serra control of the meta, that's Phantom X, and it fell off for a reason that was unrelated to it. It was pretty much just people were playing Luke Cage because it was also day one of Lady Bullseye, so it was free to include the Luke Cage in the deck, and ever since it has been mostly bad to do that because everyone got off of the stuff that Luke Cage beats. So you end up with a deck that I think is genuinely incredibly underrated right now. And if you can figure out that matchup, and I really think you can, you are in the clear against a lot of stuff. TOV, very weak into Killmonger. You have Gambit, who is just going to be able to hit a lot of stuff. You have a powerful point output plan that is supplemented by a pretty freewheeling turn 6 where you can choose a lot of different stuff. Remember that this is a tech deck, though. Your goal is to make sure that your opponent's total board output looks like it's like 15 to 20 points. And you'd be shocked how often it is capable of making that happen. Phoenix Force is a solid, fairly maximal combo deck that, by virtue of the things that it is able to do, sometimes really screws over a Captain Carter deck. For example, I lost to this deck because they gave my Captain Carter like minus 16 power, which it turns out is bad. This is the kind of thing that is not necessarily at the top of the metagame, but can absolutely compete against anything that shows up. This is a deck that has a ton of weird play lines, a ton of ability to just output points, weird things that you probably aren't expecting your opponents to deal with. If anything is a negative for this deck, and I do think that this might be real, it's looking into the future and saying, if we start becoming a super Shadow King Grandmaster heavy metagame, this deck is not built for that. It is not built for the things that are happening on the cutting edge of the metagame at the top ranks right now that I've been talking about in this video. It's not built to succeed there. But if those things aren't really percolating downwards, if they remain localized to the top of the metagame, which I think, given how difficult the Brood deck is to play, could very easily be true, this is just a really strong deck. It is, right now, if you aren't getting Shadow Kinged in 2 lanes, just gonna be able to do some real damage. All the points are green, but the numbers are crazy, and you basically always have, like, are they gonna do X or Y on turn 6 lines, where your opponent chooses to play around one thing and you do the other thing. That stuff is so powerful in a deck like this. There's so much lack of information in terms of what your actual output is going to be. Am I going to move my giant Human Torch to a lane where it's free and Zola it? Or am I going to move my Human Torch to a lane and then Heimdall it and try to win the other lane with a bunch of different cards? Like, what number are they playing around? Am I going for a fastball special Phoenix Force? Is that what's going to happen? There's a bunch of things that are possible in this list. None of them are always going to happen, and the threat of all of them is what makes it so difficult to play against. One of the baseline things that good players do when they're confronted with a combo deck like the Captain Carter stuff, when they're confronted with a bunch of decks doing Mother Askani stuff, it's very straightforward for good players to just be like, we're going to make all of that not happen. We are going to super giant you, and then we're going to play a fair game of Marvel Snap again, and that's just what we're going to try to make happen. This list comes from Gamer, and I think it's a very solid list with one notably unpleasant matchup. That matchup is Techno-Organic Virus. Super unpleasant. We have an Electra in there to deal with it right now. It might be correct to go even further in the direction of Techno-Organic Virus by playing something like a Killmonger, but largely, this is a deck that is in with a chance against most things because it's able to stop most things from getting to their maximum output or even really approaching their maximum output. When you think about what a lot of the decks in Marvel Snap are doing, turn 5 is very important to many of them, whether that be activating a Mother Askani again, or getting your Maverick down, or playing whatever piece of your combo you need to play. All of them kind of care about turn 5, which makes Supergiant a very high leverage card that does very powerful things in the context of the metagame as it is currently set up. This is a deck that is looking to play relatively fair and just go for some stats and make your opponent play fair too. And the hope is that you are much more accustomed to playing fair than they, on their unfair combo doubling deck, are going to be able to handle. Another version of the list comes from Ika, who has come to a pretty correct conclusion, I think, which is that basically all the 5-drops you can possibly play in these lists, whether they be Ozymandias for the rock package, or Ronin just because he's big, or even Devil Dinosaur if you really want to play an old favorite, they're all kind of bad. And so what if we just played a card that had a reasonably sized body and also sometimes interacted with things? And so that's how he ended up on the Enchantress, which I think is a pretty solid direction to go. One of the interesting things about this list is the inclusion of Maria Hill here, who I think is just showing up in decks like this because you always want to be curving out. There's basically no downside to including her and getting some free value that your opponent might not be able to play around. It's not common, but it can happen. Is just going to be a solid thing to do. This list is also notably packing the Scarlet Witch, which makes it pretty potent against Zombie Galacti decks, which have been on the uptick, even though I think relative to the metagame, they've gotten a little bit worse. Relative to themselves, they've gotten stronger, and people are playing them a little bit more, so having tech for a Magic deck is not a bad space to be in right now. You can also just give up on all this and play Hela, and just be like, man, everyone's getting really inbred around all these Grandmaster Shadow King things. What if I didn't care about a Shadow King at all? What if I was just a combo deck that didn't care about Shadow King, and then I beat everyone who's playing all these mid-range Shadow King decks? That's what Hela does. It's a valid metagame read, and if you think you're going to see a lot of those people messing around with Shadow King stuff, drop a Hela on their face. They usually don't have anything for that. In fact, the only deck I've seen that's playing Shadow King and also Stardust is one of the techno-organic decks, the Entrefar list that we talked about. And frankly, I'm not sure that list is going to be the one that people play for a while longer. And that's the only Stardust deck basically in the entire game that you're going to reasonably see is it's coming out of the TOV stuff a lot of the time. And so you're kind of just beating up on everything else. Like, okay, you know, nice Gambit deck you got there. Be a shame if something happened to it. Like, sorry, Gambit Horseman, I should say. Nice Victoria hand. I don't care. Cool Phantom X, bro. I have bigger numbers. Like, there's just a lot to be said for a deck that is recognizing that the metagame is warping around something and saying, what if I beat up all the people that were trying to beat that? And that's kind of what Hell is doing. Last up, in the honorary destroy spot on this list, Jaywalla and Butt have been messing around with C4, and I know you might think, wow, C4, that's really cool. It's not cool, it's just another Shadow King deck, but like, you know, we can give them some credit here. Yeah, it's just another Invisible Woman Shadow King deck. That's really all that's happening here. In fact, I wouldn't be shocked if it ended up becoming an Invisible Woman Shadow King Grandmaster deck in the near future, but that's neither here nor there. This is a deck that is trying to do a couple of specific things. One of the things that really tickles me about this list is the inclusion of Mother Askani, who is only ever going to target Cerebro or Nico Minoru. I think that's one of the funniest things anyone in the history of Marvel Snap has ever done. But also, if you ever hit the Cerebro with it, it is so busted. So, like, it does work out. But it's just, like, a card that is very mid the rest of the time. I respect what they're going for here. The other thing you could do with it is, of course, Shadow King your own Mother Askani cards back down. So you're just effectively playing her for the extra energy buff, which, again, totally viable. Very funny, very, very funny thing to do. Demonstrates a lot of why Mother Askani can be such a problematic card, because here we're basically playing her where she's like kind of actively harmful some amount of the time. And it's just like, yep, that's the thing we're trying to do. But I do think that if you're going to play a Cerebro deck, Cerebro typically lives and dies on not necessarily its own output, but its output in relation to the metagame. And being a Shadow King deck is a really smart way to go about it right now. And so you pick the Cerebro deck that does that. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. That's been KMCat. You've been phenomenal. And I'll see you in the next one. Just like, she jumped up here right as I started doing this and is dripping water all over me from her collar. I just want you to know what I go through to make this happen. She just jumps up on me, and I have to make sure it's actually water because I was afraid it was something else for a little bit. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one.